Hi, this is Dan Mumm. If you're taking this course, there's a good chance you've taken other courses of mine in the past. While this course builds on many of the concepts and ideas taught in my other courses, it's also considerably different in some key ways. On the surface, this course simply teaches intermediate to expert level neoclassical sweep arpeggio-based compositions for solo guitar. The reasons of why a guitarist like yourself might want to learn progressions like these are going to vary from person to person. Maybe you want to take your sweep technique to the next level, learn new and more complex types of sweep patterns, add neoclassical progressions like these to your repertoire, be able to write similar progressions, gain a better understanding of neoclassical style in general, take on new challenges, or something else entirely. This course was designed with all of that in mind. But as with all my courses, it's important for me to use what's taught as a vehicle for something that will apply to your guitar playing more generally and universally. The goal with this course is not so much to teach you new techniques, but to teach you how to use the techniques you've already learned or work with in some capacity in entirely new ways in order to play whatever is necessary or whatever you want. One of the core principles behind this course is the concept that the guitar should serve the music and not the other way around. This simply means that instead of being limited to work on music that utilizes techniques and patterns you already know, or allow your own writing or improvisation to be limited by those pre-existing patterns, you can and should work with whatever music you want to in its purest form, and have technique adaptable enough to play whatever is required without simplifying the music to fit your existing technical repertoire. Sweep picking and other shred techniques, from this perspective, are not about being flashy, but are merely solutions to the problem of how to play certain things on the guitar. Say for the very first one, I wrote each of the compositions for this course without the guitar in my hands. It was purely done by ear and then notated, causing me to have to use problem solving to figure out optimal and efficient methods of playing them on the guitar. I made only a few small changes to the compositions to allow for a linear increase in difficulty from one progression to the next. As you'll see, this approach to writing and then problem solving my way into figuring out how to play them on the guitar led to some very unusual solutions and likewise unusual techniques. Musically speaking, this way, the only real limitations are that of the guitar itself. And the guitar is a lot less limiting than you might think. Okay, now this idea may sound overwhelming to you or even unrealistic at first. But once you get started into the exercises and I show you the methods of practice and examples of this approach, you'll soon see just how accessible and powerful it really is. Beyond the technical purposes of this course, it's also my goal to give you new tools to use for music analysis, composition, and even improvisation. With that in mind, I take the time to break down points of musical interest, such as why certain chord changes or arpeggios work within the neoclassical style, or how various techniques of composition allow for particular melodic and harmonic effects, such as drawing the listener's ear in a certain direction, creating or elevating expectation, emphasizing particular notes or transitions, and so on. While these aspects of this course are not the central theme, I use them to round out the course in such a way to ensure that you leave with a much deeper understanding of how these types of progressions and compositions work. This will give you a real leg up if you're looking to write your own neoclassical style compositions, but also it's going to give you some tools to learn and figure out neoclassical progressions and neoclassical style solos and passages in general much more quickly. Even if a lot of what I go over in this course is beyond your current level in terms of music theory or music analysis, you'll at least complete this course with a lot of new ideas to try while improvising or when working on your next song. Another benefit of these breakdowns that may take a little while for you to fully notice is that it's going to give you some new perspectives that will help you recognize why music sounds a certain way and help you to emulate those sounds. Even if you were to simply think of these concepts as a little bag of tricks, they can be absolutely transformative in your playing and understanding of music in the long term. Now, this course is laid out in 11 sections. That's 10 sections that each break down and teach a unique neoclassical sweep arpeggio-based composition, and an opening section of 5 exercises that simply teaches and demonstrates the approach to practice that's recommended for this course. As you'll soon see, that approach to practice is also fundamental to the layout of this course. This approach is one of the most effective ways of learning, memorizing, and mastering anything on the guitar. And it's also incredibly simple and easy to use. When coupled with the 5-iteration metronome practice method that I talk about so often, it creates what I have found to be, at least, an absolutely optimal approach to practice. It may even be the most optimal approach to practice. That combination was a key element of how I achieved my own current level of playing, and is also the method I use to learn, memorize, and master each of the progressions I demonstrate in this course. If this is the first course of mine you've taken and you're unfamiliar with that 5-iteration metronome practice method I just mentioned, you'll find it described in step-by-step instructions at the start of the PDF tab ebook included on the download page for this course. One of the most important aspects of practice is also one of the most often overlooked. That is, that practice in itself is a skill, just like playing the guitar. The more you increase your repertoire of practice techniques and methods, and the more you increase your skill of practicing, the better you get at practicing and the faster your progress becomes. The method that these first 5 exercises are designed to teach can fit all 3 definitions. As I mentioned previously, this method will allow you to learn, memorize, and master anything on the guitar when used correctly. And I assure you, that's not an exaggeration. While the content of these first 5 exercises is extremely simple and will likely seem far below your current skill level, what's crucial about these exercises are not the specific technique or patterns they teach, but instead it's the practice approach they demonstrate. Right after these first 5 exercises, we're going to be getting into learning the first actual neoclassical progression. Each progression we work through will be broken down into smaller individual exercises that will ultimately combine together into the complete progression. As you likely already know pretty well, this is a standard approach to learning something on the guitar, especially a longer piece of music. It allows you to put the appropriate amount of time into each section, spending additional time on the areas that are more difficult for you. And it's also critical for memorization. By breaking it down into sections like these, you don't have to memorize, say, 100 notes and all the changes and everything all together at the same time. You can just break it down and memorize one little piece at a time. However, in this course, the way in which I've broken down the progressions for the individual exercises should not be seen as final. Each section of each progression can and should be broken down into smaller parts as needed. Because each person taking this course will be at a different level of playing, how each section should be broken down will depend on your specific needs. If I were to have designed this course with the exercises broken down for any possible player's needs, we would have ended up with an absurd number of exercises and a great deal of redundancy for most players. Instead, I'm going to show you the method of breaking the parts down and leave it to you to start utilizing this practice method. Anytime you find yourself struggling with any individual exercise, section, or transition in this course, you can apply the following method. Also, don't worry, the level and format of these first 5 exercises is not at all representative of the level and format of the rest of the course. These exercises break down a standard A minor 5-string sweep pattern into its smallest possible parts, building up to the next smallest, and so on until the full pattern is achieved. This is all simply meant to demonstrate this practice method, so it's exaggerated a bit for that purpose. In most cases, you shouldn't have to break something down to parts as small as this. Make sure you're watching your fingering and picking direction very carefully while working through each of these exercises and parts. For part A, we're merely sweeping through 2 notes. That is the 12th fret of the 5th string and the 10th fret of the 4th string. All you need to do here is play through those 2 notes with a sweeping motion. Even though this is extremely simple, run each part of these exercises with a metronome. Set a medium tempo goal on the metronome that will apply to each part of the first 5 exercises, and then don't continue with any of these parts until you've achieved it while perfectly articulating each note. You don't have to try to go for extreme speed here. Just go for a comfortable, even medium tempo. For part B, we're again sweeping through 2 notes. This time we're starting on the 10th fret of the 4th string and moving to the 9th fret of the 3rd string. A 2-note section is obviously the smallest piece anything will ever need to be broken down into. Usually you won't need to break anything down into something this small. But for certain types of transitions, fingering, or position shifts, it can be extremely effective. Again, don't continue until you've achieved your speed goal with the metronome with perfect articulation. For part C, we're merely combining parts A and B together. Now we have a 3-note section. For part A of exercise 2, we continue in the same method through the same A minor arpeggio. Again, we start with just 2 notes. For part B, we're combining exercise 1B and 2A together. This is the same idea as part 1C. We're simply playing the next 3 notes of the full arpeggio pattern. For part C, we're simply combining everything we've worked on so far. This is now a 4-note section. We've taken the time to focus on each individual note transition so far, as well as each possible grouping of notes that would make up this 4-note pattern. If you are completely new to sweep picking, you can see how effective this approach would be for mastering each part of a sweep pattern. By combing through each 2-note and 3-note section, we can find and isolate any trouble areas before they cause any trouble. By holding each part to the same standard of tempo and articulation, you'll naturally have to spend more time on the parts that cause you difficulty and less time on the parts that don't. This forces you to isolate and iron out any weaknesses in your technique. Exercise 3 is formatted in the same way as exercise 2. We move on to the next 2-note section, combine them with the previous note to get a 3-note section, and then combine them with the previous note to get another 4-note section. Exercise 4 is again formatted in the same way. The only difference now is the addition of a hammer-on the 1st string. And now we're going to put it all together to get a standard 5-string A minor sweep arpeggio. Well, you're probably already quite familiar with this pattern. If you followed the instructions, you should find it much easier and much cleaner than ever before. As you can see, we weren't merely breaking down this arpeggio. We were also combining different parts of it together before playing the entire thing. The same thing can and should be done for the exercises in this course. There will be some difficult transitions that occur between 2 parts in many of these progressions. Except for one case that's used for demonstration, the way the exercises are broken down for each progression don't cover transitions between 2 parts of the progression. While practicing the parts back to back will help to solve the problem, you can also break down the exercises in such a way to focus exclusively on each transition you need to. For example, you may want to practice the last 2 notes of an exercise along with the first two notes of the next exercise. And that would be to isolate and hone in specifically on a difficult transition between them. I'll make sure to point out the more difficult transitions as we go along. Our first progression is the easiest found in this course, but still provides some unexpected challenges. It's almost entirely made up of three-note sweep patterns that you're likely already familiar with. However, with the use of the rolling bar technique and some unusual transitions, it will likely still pose a satisfying challenge to you. The exercises themselves don't go in order of difficulty within each section, but rather in order of how they're found in the progression. Even though they're not increasing in difficulty linearly within any one progression, each overall progression will be preparing you for the ones that come later. This progression is in the key of C minor, but it also uses a flat fifth and a sharp seventh as accidentals at various points. While the flat fifth is probably most familiar to you from the minor pentatonic blues scale, it's also among the most common accidentals found in classical music, and has tremendous potential for neoclassical. The sharp seventh is of course from harmonic minor, which is obviously the most common scale used in neoclassical shred styles. Since this is in the key of C minor, the flat fifth is a G flat, and is written with the flat symbol. Since the seventh note of the key of C minor is a B flat, the sharp seventh is a B natural, written with the natural symbol. This first exercise will immediately be familiar to you, as it's simply the top three strings of the same arpeggio shape we went over in the first three exercises. While that was an A minor arpeggio, in this case it's a C minor arpeggio. Now we'll be going through the diminished version of the same arpeggio shape. This one is a G flat diminished arpeggio. I should take a moment here to point out that the picking direction in these individual exercises is just set up for playing the arpeggio on its own in this one exercise. So you may find some differences in the final progression, especially having to do with the first or last notes being picked. For this exercise, we're going through an A-flat arpeggio on three strings. This is a different arpeggio shape than what we've worked on so far, and now requires the use of a rolling bar technique with your second finger. If you've already gone through my course, Sweep Picking Mastery, you should already be pretty familiar with the rolling bar technique. However, if you're new to it, you'll need to spend some additional time getting the technique down. Rolling bar works just as the name implies. It's the same concept you'd find in a bar chord, that is, using a single finger to fret multiple strings. However, for this technique, we need to roll the finger, or rather, shift where we're applying pressure to play only one note at a time. In this case, you begin with your second finger on the 13th fret of the third string. You'll need to be prepared to use the fingerprint area of your finger to fret the 13th fret of the second string. When making this shift, you need to roll your finger in such a way that pressure is removed from the third string at the same moment it's being shifted to the second string. We only want one note to be heard at a time. Again, if you're new to this technique, or you haven't yet mastered it, take your time with it. This technique is going to be found all throughout the progressions in this course. Just like any technique, you can absolutely get it down by just working through it slowly. It'll get easier and easier the more you work on it, so put the time in now before you develop any bad playing habits that could become even more difficult to fix later. Now we have another three-string sweep pattern, a D diminished seventh. This time, however, we're playing the fourth, third, and second strings. This is a good example of something that gets overlooked fairly often when working through a technique like sweep picking. Since it's most common to learn three-string sweep patterns on the first three strings, it can give a false impression this is the only place to play them. However, a wide variety of interesting free string patterns can be found on any three adjacent strings. Instead of having to shift positions when going through an arpeggio progression, you can often find the arpeggio you're looking for right around where you left off with the last one. You can simply find the root note and start going through the different possible patterns until you find the one that works best. And then, of course, you don't actually have to start the pattern on the root note. It can often be better to use an inversion, both technically and harmonically, when considering what the implied baseline would be in the progression. We'll talk more about that later. Now we're going through another pattern that should be familiar to you from our first 5 exercises, at least at first. We have a 3-note section of a C minor arpeggio played on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. However, we'll be using a hammer-on and pull-off on the 2nd string. This creates a somewhat awkward reach from the 2nd to 4th finger. Be sure to take your time with it. This awkward transition falls right around the line of when finger tapping would become a solution for extending your reach. In this case, we really don't need to use it, and instead reach up with the 4th finger. But don't worry, we'll have plenty of examples of using finger tapping as a solution to a similar problem in the later progressions. Now we have a G 3-string sweep pattern, using a rolling bar with the first finger on all 3 strings. Again, this 3-string pattern is on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. Take your time with the rolling bar to make sure each note comes out clearly. Remember that the fastest avenue to achieve articulation at high speeds is to start as slow as is necessary to play it perfectly. And then you need to take your time with it until you've internalized the technique. Working backwards from rushing through it and trying to break bad playing habits will always take exponentially more time than simply doing it correctly the first time around. So approaching the practice correctly is the fastest way to get the technique you want. Rushing it always takes longer. And unfortunately, in most cases, it leads to the guitarist never actually achieving the result they're looking for. Now we have another C minor pattern, this time on 4 strings, and you'll also recognize this from our first 5 exercises. For the final exercise, before we put the whole progression together, we have a G 5-string sweep arpeggio that uses a slide with the first finger to reach the last note instead of a hammer-on. This slide may be unnecessary in the context of this individual sweep pattern, but critically shifts the position to allow us to reach the last note of the composition, as you'll soon see. Here we again use a rolling bar on 3 strings, this time with the 2nd finger. Before putting all these patterns together into the final progression, I want to reiterate what we went over earlier about combining sections to practice. If we look at all those exercises as pairs, it's obvious that some pairs will be more difficult for you than others, and some transitions between different patterns will be more difficult than others. Even though we've worked through the entire progression now in these individual sections, I urge you not to rush ahead into simply practicing the entire progression. Instead, I recommend going through the progression a few times slowly and discovering which transitions will be the most difficult for you, and then spend some time working on those transitions, or pairs of sections, until you've reached a particular tempo goal, as we did with the first 5 exercises. You may even want to spend some time working on each pair of exercises with the metronome. Always remember that spending this type of time is not actually spending additional time, but is instead spending less time practicing. The more optimal your approach is to mastering these techniques, the faster you'll achieve the results you're looking for. If you try to simply power through something you're not ready for, the best you can really hope for is a sloppy result and bad playing habits. And bad playing habits are usually much more difficult to correct. Also, note that the picking direction is different at the start of many of the sections in the final progression. Watch the fingering very carefully, use the metronome, and take your time with it. Before we continue to the second progression, let me take a brief moment to go over fingering and picking direction for this course. Because of the nature of these progressions, the fingering and picking directions shown on the tabs are based on what feels most natural for my playing style. Therefore, it's best to see them as merely a suggestion. As you go through this course, you may notice some exercises where my demonstration doesn't follow the fingering or picking direction exactly how it's written on the tabs. That's simply because while one fingering or picking direction may appear optimal while first working through a pattern, when put to the test, you may unconsciously find one that suits you better. In some cases, the fingering is absolutely optimal or even completely necessary, while in others, other fingerings might work even better for your playing style. The most important thing is to use a fingering and picking direction that serves what's being played. Never simply what's most expedient in any given moment. In many cases, the fingering may seem strange or unnecessarily difficult at first. But as you move to the next note or transition, it should become clear why that fingering is necessary. If, on the other hand, you find that it wasn't really necessary and a better fingering suits you, feel free to change it to what works best for you. But I strongly recommend you to use the fingering and picking direction as it's shown while working through the sections of each progression. And that's since you won't necessarily know the reason for it until we put it all together into the progression. Once you get to the section where we put the whole progression together, you'll be able to determine if and when to make those changes. Use this as an opportunity to pay attention to the utility of fingering and picking direction from the perspectives of problem solving and optimization.